So, welcome to the Boston Graduate School of Psychoanalysis. I'm Dr. Wagner, and I just want to orient you to what we're going to be doing this evening. This is the regular class meeting of my semester-long course on unconscious processes in dreams. And tonight it's open to all of you guests, and we also have a guest speaker, which we don't usually have. So it's a mashup of all different things tonight. I understand we have some philosophy students in the audience. Can you show me where you are? Okay, and you're all part of a class, right? Okay. And we have some BGSP students who are in my course sitting in the front, and maybe people who've heard about it for the first time. Is anybody here for the first time? Okay, so some brand new people. Great. All right, well, welcome everyone. BGSP is a combination of a psychoanalytic institute and a graduate school. So we offer the full psychoanalytic training and also academic degrees. And this class is an elective in the program. So in the course are people from different levels in the program, different programs within the school. And the assignment for the course is on your chair, in case you want to know what we're doing. It's two-sided. It's a worksheet that students take notes on each week when they're seeing the films. It's actually every other week usually when we meet. And complete the written assignment. So that just helps orient you, I think, to what we usually do. I'm going to tell you a couple of things about the way we're working with dreams in the course. We're applying Freud's dream analysis model to the overall content of the films. So I'll give you a quick crib sheet of this method. A dream, an ordinary dream, is understood as the representation, the symbolic representation of a wish that is being fulfilled through the action and the imagery of the dream. And so you might think, well, a lot of dreams are scary and terrible and, have images of a lot of danger. And these are some, if they're classified as nightmares, they also contain wishes for things like punishment, which expiates guilt, or things like being in the position of the person doing the harm without realizing it. So there are a lot of disguised wishes and reversals and so on that are going on in dreams. And the function of the dream really is to protect our sleep. It's to let us work on these conflicts outside of our conscious awareness so that we can stay asleep at night and we're not being woken up by what's upsetting us when our defenses are down, when we're sleeping. Symbols. I'll give you an idea of some of the symbolic representations that are in this film. Can you still hear me? Not too well. Is that better? Okay, is that better? All right. So in this film, there are biblical symbols in the names of the characters: Caleb, Nathan, and Ava, or as Mr. Alwyn said, Eve 2.0, which I like. There's Frankenstein intertext. There are quotes from Robert Oppenheimer, credited with the invention of the atomic bomb. There are references to Ghostbusters, various movies about artificial intelligence, Alice in Wonderland, childhood, and maturation, to name but a few. So the intertext, the sort of symbolic underpinning, is analogous to the person's associations inside an analytic session. It adds layers to our understanding. Another dream principle is that very often in a dream things are reversed. So, for example, Nathan and Caleb are both prophets in the Bible, and they both have a very good reputation. They were both considered loyal and helpful and so on. And in this case, Caleb is represented exactly as he was in the Bible, as a scout who went forward into the Promised Land and then returned to tell the Jews in exile that it was safe to go there. Nathan, on the other hand, is depicted in the film as a complete reversal of how he was in the Bible. Various other things. Actions in a dream reveal motives. Fears are often disguised wishes. What look like conscious wishes may also be disguised fears. The things that occur in a sequence are related just by the law of association. So, for example, remember in the film when Nathan was passing out and he was falling on his bed, and he says lights, and the lights go down. It was a very small scene, but it was right at the moment when the light went on in Caleb's head about what was really going on. And finally, each part in a dream, each character, each action, each event, each association, each subtext is a part of the dreamer's dynamics. So it might be the wish, it might be the defense, it might be part of the history, it might be something they're projecting, and usually is something they're projecting into other people. But when you use dream analysis to analyze a cultural product like a film, or when you're trying to understand your own dream or your patient's dream, to look at the whole thing as a reflection of the conflict that the person is having. And in this case, the case of a cultural product, the conflict that a culture is having, so us in this age of technology. Look at the whole situation and then analyze the wish structure from there, rather than just the parts, rather than just the story of one character, for example. Finally, dreams and especially wish-fulfilling fantasies in literature and film very often have a round structure. So remember when Caleb was, when the helicopter dropped him off, do you remember what he said? He said, "Are you going to leave me here?" So, and in the very end, what happened? Ava left him there. So these are indications of the fullness, the beginning and the end of the story are very often the same. Then I'll just tell you one more thing about dreams. There's a separate, well, there are nightmares, which are different from ordinary wish-fulfilling dreams. We're not going to talk about those tonight. And there are anxiety dreams. And I think this film can be classified as an anxiety dream. And the wish in an anxiety dream is different from an ordinary wish-fulfilling dream in that the person is calling up a small dose of what's making them anxious in order to practice mastering it. So think about anxiety dreams where you're, suddenly it's the exam and you haven't studied and you don't even know where the classroom is, and yet you have to take the exam. Or, you're at the drugstore and suddenly you're naked and everybody else is clothed and you don't know how you got there. These are, sort of prototypical anxiety dreams. So I'm going to argue that this dream is a rehearsal. It's a sort of practicing how we can deal with dangers in the current world that we have, specifically related to our technological capacities. So that's all I'm going to say for now, and I'm going to introduce our guest speaker. We have with us tonight Wes Alwyn, who is an occasional BGSP student and the co-founder and everyone's favorite member of the podcast, The Partially Examined Life. So Mr. Alwyn's going to talk about 10 minutes with a philosophical angle. And then we're going to have a discussion, and we're going to try and make links between all these things. And everybody is welcome to participate at that point. Any questions so far about this? Any dream questions? Or? Okay.
How's the sound? Good? All right. So I think my reading of the film sort of fails the classroom assignment because I'm not explicitly reading it as a dream, but hopefully we can make those connections by the end of it. I did want to mention that I advertised this talk on Facebook, and I actually had quite a bit of trouble advertising it because they kept rejecting the ad. Telling me that I was trying to advertise adult sex toys, which I thought was really telling. They saw the picture of Ava and something about libido in the title, and so it's telling. I think it's really telling in two senses. It's on the one hand, you could sort of re-ask the question of the film, whether or not Ava has artificial intelligence, as whether she's actually a sex toy. And apparently Facebook falls on the sex toy side. And I say that because the sort of iterations of Ava leading up to her, right? Nathan's creations seem like sort of sex dolls. So it's only with Ava he has someone who he calls his daughter, and the relationship doesn't seem to be entirely sexual. So, and the other part of it is just, I couldn't figure out whether I was actually dealing with robots when I was arguing with them, trying to say, this is actually film discussion. This is not, I swear to God, it's not. Just read the description. And I got these sort of, I couldn't tell if the responses were automated because they were signed with people's names, you know. But the responses were so bureaucratic that, you know, they were essentially robotic. So I thought that was interesting. So I think, you know, so speaking of Ava and whether or not, you know, the difficulty in telling who she is, I think one of the things that really attracted me to this film was the subtlety of her characterization. If you think of the typical cliche depiction of a robot or an artificially intelligent creature in a science fiction film, there's often a lack of affect or sort of a robotic behavior. And the idea seems to be that it's one thing to breathe or to bequeath intelligence to some creature, but it's entirely another to give them emotions, affect, and desire, libido, all the things that go into that side of human nature. I think the idea is that those things are actually harder. So I think Ava really defies that. And in fact, I actually, just before I came into the talk, I looked at the shooting script of the film, which is actually a little bit different than the film because they cut out scenes and also you get to read descriptions. So Alex Garland, the director of the film, was actually also a novelist before he became a filmmaker, has interesting little directions in there. Like, so he explicitly says Ava's voice is not, there's no digital artifacts in her voice. And you can see that the interesting way she's characterized, it's not like she's completely human, but she's not obviously robotic either. There's some suspense over exactly what she is and whether or not she has everything that's required to be artificially intelligent. So I think there's a poignance to her character. There's a sense in which she seems impassive, and maybe you think there might be some sort of lack of emotion there, but then there are poignant moments where she's obviously indignant, and there's a whole, there's the way she moves, which is different. There's a formality to it, but again, not obviously robotic. So And I think the reason why that characterization is important is because the film really speaks to the question of what is the relationship between desire and artificial intelligence, or really human consciousness, this human type of consciousness associated with language use and self-consciousness and everything that goes along with it. And I think, really Nathan, Ava's creator, Nathan, kind of answers that question up front. He has a theory about what's required for artificial intelligence. And the theory is that desire is necessary. Without desire, there's no motivation for human interaction. And without that component, you can't truly have a conscious being. So again, completely flips the stereotypical idea of science fiction, artificially intelligent science fiction creatures on its head. It's not just that you create this intelligent being and then maybe you can give them emotions as a bonus. The two things are tied together inextricably. Then there's the question of what does it mean to actually give this creature desire? There's a really interesting part in the film where Caleb is suspicious that Nathan has programmed Ava to like him specifically. And then there's a sequence of scenes that leads up to a really great scene in front of a Jackson Pollock painting where Nathan's explaining to him that Ava, if he had programmed Ava that specifically, then she couldn't truly be artificially intelligent. So it's not just desire that's required, it's a certain kind of autonomy associated with desire. Ava has to be able, in a sense, to dance to the beat of her own drummer. She can't have every little choice, every little action programmed into her. You can't specifically program her, who it is she's going to like and so on and so forth, because then her desire actually just reflects the desire of her creator. So for her to be an artificially intelligent creature, her desire really must be independent in some sense of the desire of the creator, even though he programs and creates the conditions of her desire. For instance, he tells Nathan that he programs her to be heterosexual. And I think, it's important to mention that when we talk about desire, I think we're talking about something more complicated than just libido, because I think all of the faculties go into desire. Desire is informed by culture and conscience and experience, so by ego and superego. So desire is a complex thing. We can want things, we can be responding to the desire of others, we can be responding to the desire of our parents. It's not simply impulse, and if it were simply impulse, then we could see Ava as simply a being driven by her impulses and lacking precisely the kind of autonomy that Nathan, I think, correctly thinks she needs in order to be truly conscious and artificially intelligent. So then, we learn in the film that Caleb is there to test her, right? And that the film is structured around this series of interviews, this series of sessions. And on the face of it, he is going to see if she can pass as human through these conversations, and to see if her responses are natural enough. And we find out by the end of the film, he's really there to test her desire, in a sense, to see if she can be an object of desire for him, if he can be an object of desire for her, and then to test her autonomy. In the end, Nathan will say the real test was to see if Ava could manipulate Caleb into helping her escape. One other aspect here is there's a really interesting conflict between the character of Nathan and what's required for his project to succeed. So Nathan seems to be highly narcissistic, and there's lots of evidence that he wants control. Specifically, he wants control over the desire of others. So for instance, Ava's previous iterations, the different versions that have led up to her, as I mentioned, sort of look like sex dolls, and there's a point in the movie where Caleb finds parts of them, or various parts of them, or whole dolls, deactivated in Nathan's wardrobe. And we find out that Kyoko is a robot, and he's using her as a sexual partner, but he keeps her mute So there's lots of evidence that Nathan, part of his project, and it's interesting that Caleb asked him, well, why did you give Ava desire? And he explains, well, desire is necessary, but part of it is you can see how Nathan is using technology in a way which enables his seclusion, right? He can have a sexual partner, and he can have certain kinds of pseudo-human interaction up to a point without the demands that real human beings make, and without the costs of real human relationships. He can sort of have his cake and eat it too. So that conflict between the desire of the creator and the desire of what's created, the necessity that the creature's desire sort of become autonomous of the creator's desire, I thought was a really interesting one in the movie. One scene I think we should talk about is this really interesting disco scene, which is, I think, one of the first things I thought about, because I didn't understand it when I saw the movie. This scene where, and this happens not too long after the Pollock scene, where Nathan has lectured Caleb about the necessity of autonomy, right? And then he flips a switch, his living room turns into a disco, and Nathan says, I'm going to tear up the dance floor, and him and Kyoko do this synchronized, choreographed dance routine, as if to say, actually, I do prefer my robots to lack autonomy. I do prefer my creatures to lack autonomy. He's almost like a puppeteer, and she's the marionette. She's doing exactly his routine. But what's required for artificial intelligence is that she execute her own routine. So we can think of Kyoko as a previous iteration of Ava that hasn't gotten to Ava's level of advancement, and in a way, that's what Nathan prefers. When we get to Ava, we have someone who has her own will, wants her own freedom, and so at a psychological level, she's on the verge of freedom, or maybe is free, but he has to keep her imprisoned. So that's the only way he can control her. But we'll note that he doesn't make a sex slave of Ava the way I think of the previous iterations as sort of sex slaves. So I think for Nathan, it's a turnoff for Ava to have her own humanity, really. And so the other thing I saw in the movie is a parallel between Nathan's use of technology and our use of technology as a society in general. So Nathan is, like I said, I think using technology to avoid his own desire in the fullest sense, and to avoid human contact in the full sense, the demands of other people's desire. And so I began to think of Ava as sort of the final stage of our advancement, of an advance that is reflected in our smartphones and our other smart things. And I think it's telling that we call it a smartphone, right? As if there's some sort of, it's as if it's on the way to artificial intelligence. And if you think about the way we use technology socially, smartphones, social networks, the media, or social media, it serves as a kind of buffer for human interaction. I think it makes it less demanding. It makes it less anxiety-producing. It kind of damps down the possibility of disappointment and loss. So, for instance, if you're able to take out your cell phone, even during like a real human interaction, and distract yourself with it, then the disappointments of that actual social interaction are less costly in a sense. There's this idea of having a magic tool and a whole world of social possibilities available through that tool, as if you could leap from flower to flower, and it doesn't, you haven't put all your chips on this particular social situation. So I thought we could talk about, in the discussion portion, we could talk about the ways in which that kind of use of technology sort of facilitates what the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein called a manic defense, this defense that allows us to avoid feelings of loss and sadness and other negative feelings that are really implicated in human intimacy. And we'll note that, again, if the smartphone were to truly become smart, right, it would defeat really one of the magical qualities, one of the whole purposes of it, Because if it were truly smart, it would make exactly the kinds of demands and disappoint us in exactly the kinds of ways that real human beings disappoint us, and it would really defeat the purpose. So, unless of course we lock them up in the way that Nathan fucks Ava up. I thought all of this really, one of the other things I wanted to think about with the film, so let's see how far I've gone into this, was why it was called Ex Machina. And it really wasn't, I thought it's kind of puzzling to me too. It sort of evokes this phrase Deus Ex Machina, which is a plot device. It's known for its use in some ancient Greek plays where basically a crane and pulley system lowers a god or goddess onto the stage or has it fly across the stage. And that sort of ending is meant to sort of ameliorate an otherwise tragic ending, to give it some sort of redemption. So for instance, in Euripides' Hippolytus, Artemis will appear and she'll tell Theseus, who up to this point thinks his son Hippolytus has slept with his wife and raped his wife Phaedra, that actually he didn't do it. So it's a way of, there's still a tragic ending, but it, Euripides especially, and Nietzsche criticized them for this, like to give a happy sort of little spin to these tragic endings. A sort of allergy to tragedy develops. So I think we can think of that as, you know, something parallel to this manic defense, this idea of denying the tragic element of human life. So the Deus here, so if you're thinking about, well, what is the Deus and what is the Machina in the film, you can think of well, let's think about it with respect to our use of technology first. I think in the case of the smartphone, you would think of the smartphone as the Machina, and then the sort of omnipotent power, the manic defense, as the Deus, or the God. So I don't think I mentioned that Deus Ex Machina is you translate as God out of the machine. And let's see, so that's all well and good until you sort of get this merger between Deus and Machina, and that's really what Ava represents. So there's this lurking, in the film, there's this lurking idea of what's called the technological singularity. It's something that some philosophers like to talk about these days. It's this moment where the idea is that once you get artificially intelligent creatures, they will get to the point where they can design themselves, where they can enhance their own intelligence. So in a sense, they become self-creators. And at that point, there's a snowball effect. There's this recursion where they get smart enough, they make themselves smarter, which allows them to make themselves even smarter until they become these godlike beings, and until they become the Deus, essentially. And the worry there is that will lead to the destruction of the world. These robots, these artificially intelligent robots, will enslave or destroy the human race. So I think that worry, in one sense, reflects this worry about the way in which technology can obliterate desire, so make us, the way in which our use of technology can make us less human and more robotic. Because you get this idea that robots might obliterate desire on this cosmic scale, get rid of humanity altogether. But it's interesting that Nathan, as a side note, Nathan actually is not that worried about it. He sort of embraces this idea that he is the person he's excited about being the person who might be bringing about the end of the world. And I think that fits with his character of someone who is interested in obliterating the desire of others, even as he gratifies his own desire. But then the question of, what does Ava represent in the end? Is she this kind of malevolent, godlike creature it's the beginning of wiping out the human race, or is she something else? Because we might think that if she actually possesses the desire that Nathan thinks she must possess to be artificially intelligent, that's not all that bad. Does it matter that she doesn't have the flesh of a human being? In a way, it's possible that with desire and affect and emotion, she sort of carries on this project of human consciousness, regardless of what kind of physical body she inhabits. So, and then that question in turn, the ending of the movie is a little bit bleak in the sense that she seems to be without conscience. And I think that idea that these robots will lack conscience, again, that goes back to this stereotype we began to talk with of robots being lacking affect and emotion, and this, I think the fear that underlies that is this fear that they might be without conscience. But in the end, I think that depends on the creator, or if you like, the parent. It's really a question of parenting, who Ava turns out to be. So if she is a psychopath, she's sort of a chip off the old block, right? She's Nathan. She's really more like her father than we would like her to be. But of course, she could represent something else. So that's the ambiguity, I think, at the end of the film. So we can lead into the discussion now.
Okay, so there's a standing mic in the aisle, and there's a handheld mic in the back, and a volunteer who's going to pass you the handheld mic if you can't easily get to the standing one. What do you think?
Well, I'm standing here by the camera, but I'll
Can you hear in the back?
Can you hear me?
No.
Yeah? I'll go.
Come to this one.
Wes, you're taller than I am. Like you, I puzzled about that Deus Ex Machina part, and I kept looking though for where is it? It's got to be there, and I landed on Kyoko, and I wondered if you had any thoughts about that, because in some ways she's this character who does literally out of the machine offer this miraculous solution to liberate, if you think of Ava as the protagonist, the damsel in distress. But at the same time, I thought she represented another fear that we have with technology, which is about the threat of compliance as opposed to cooperation when you are dealing with a creature of autonomy or of some, intelligent, independent experience. So I just wondered what you thought about Kyoko's role and whether you could speak to that.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I watched the film again right before coming to this talk because I realized I hadn't seen it in a while. I would have forgotten all these interesting things. So I
didn't have a chance to watch the movie again. Who was Kyoko? Sorry.
So Kyoko is the Asian.
The other girl.
Who turns out to be a robot. Nathan's mistress, who turns out to be also a robot. So, and she, so she helps. It's unclear. So she ends up helping Ava escape in the end, in part by helping her murder Nathan, which I think he deserved, if anyone deserves it. But so what's interesting, I think, about Kyoko is that, I think we're meant to think of her again as a previous version, as one of the. I think at some point he calls Ava version 9.6. So I don't know how many of these versions there are supposed to be, but I think we're supposed to think of Kyoko as one of them, and she has a level of advancement that he's comfortable with sharing his bedroom with and sharing his house with, and that includes making her mute. Although I think she actually whispers to Ava at the end, and he tells Caleb that she just can't speak English, which of course is not the case. But for whatever reason, we don't hear her speak in the movie. But what's interesting is she makes this actual transition from obedience and from lack of autonomy to autonomy. She actually develops as a character in the movie, and I think usually in a film that kind of character development is not reserved for a supporting cast member. She's really has if you think about it, the strongest sort of development from obedience to complete rebellion. Because Ava, it's unclear. It seems like she's manipulating the situation all along. She has her own will all along. So I think it's interesting that we get to see that it's almost as if Nathan has designed someone in Kyoko who is on the verge of having a will. And so she has enough to be a satisfying companion for him, but not too much. But in the end, it turned out she's capable of evolving. Remember the brain, the gelatinous brain that he wants to be able to reshape itself. I think we can think that apparently that has happened with Kyoko. So.
I want to know what you think about whether the interaction between Ava and Kyoko meets that test of, what was it called, something singularity? Because Ava learned from experience, but she was also able, evidently, very quickly to transfer to Kyoko a lot of information that Kyoko had not already had, and Kyoko seemed to take that in and be able to act on it immediately. So it sounds to me like that met that test.
Say more about met what test?
That test of what you're calling something or other singularity. What is it called?
Oh, right, yeah. So technological singularity. Yeah, so that's a really good point. And I actually had forgotten about the sense in which, Ava is also influencing Kyoko. So we can see this as, so the technological singularity is really worried about this sort of evolution, although I think it's generally cast in terms of robots designing better robots. But if we think of an artificially intelligent creature as sort of having the psychological plasticity necessary to be intelligent, we could think of them evolving without any sort of hardware changes, right? And then, and we could think about relationships as one means of that sort of evolution. And I really missed this idea that Ava influences Kyoko and helps her cross this certain threshold, and then Kyoko in turn helps Ava. So.
Yeah, can you come to the mic, or you're going to get the cordless? Good.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. So we were talking on the drive-in. We're both PL aficionados, both gone through all 128 episodes. But we're talking a little bit about, we've talked about how Ava evolves, but we were talking about at what point do we start having obligations as sentient beings, as emotive beings to this creation. I mean, we started to do that with some species of animals. There are some countries that's declared dolphins to be non-human persons. We're trying to figure out what that means. But as the robots become more self whatever, at what point do we then have corresponding obligations to them?
I'm going to let Mr. Alwyn answer that, but just to underline that you're introducing the moral element, which I think is a big part of this film, and which we can talk about more in both in the philosophical and the psychological aspects.
I think it's so that's sort of one of the paradoxes of this. At the point where you have this ability to create artificial intelligence, it sort of rests on, psychological autonomy. And of course, any creature with psychological autonomy is going to want actual autonomy. It's not going to want to be kept in a room the way Ava has been kept, right? She's never even seen the outside when we meet her. So, in a way, our obligation is to free them. That's I think that's the. That's also part of the worry, is whether or not once we free them, whether or not they are going to reciprocate our treatment, our attempt to be ethical. So, what else was I going to say there? And I think I thought too of this parallel between. Because of course this isn't the only situation in which we are creators of creatures, right? The prototypical situation is being a parent, and actually bringing someone into the world and, in some sense, having some responsibility to this creature, and ultimately that responsibility, right, if this creature is to mature, is to allow them to escape parental desire, allow them to escape the sort of prison of the parental household and be their own person. So, did you have anything to add to that?
Nope. What else?
So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, Wes, thanks for your comments. I wanted to ask you a little bit about this idea of desire a little more, because I think it's a useful term. So, the movie's interesting because, we violate the Turing test. So, he already knows that she's a machine. Right. So, now we're just really figuring out, does she have a mind? And so, the theory of mind then becomes a really big question there. It seems to me that the notion of desire is there, but a very specific type, and I think that type is manipulation. So Nathan's manipulating Caleb, and vice versa. And for Nathan, the real test is whether or not, Ava can manipulate Caleb to convince him to help her out. So I was just wondering if there's a sense here, whether or not there's kind of a darkness about this that's viable. That is, the thing that makes us human is the ability to manipulate each other in these ways that aren't positive ways. So, some of the worst forms of torture are forms of manipulation. So I'm just wondering if anything like desire fits into that idea for you of manipulation actually being the key to what it means to be human. Just, like in Blade Runner, we have like the emotion test, and maybe that's not enough. Or the Cartesian test, language, maybe that's not enough. Maybe you have to be able to really treat people poorly to really be a human being.
Right, that's a really, I don't think I can put it any better than that. But yeah, I think, so part of the test of human consciousness is not just to have desire, but to have a desire that's informed by the desire of others, to have, to be aware of the desire of others, right? And the director of this film, Alex Garland, he's read a lot of books. He actually, he's inspired by a lot of philosophy, including Wittgenstein, on what it means to use language, and which comes down fundamentally. It's not possible to be a language user without being attuned to what other people want. So that's part of it. The dark side of that is, or we might think of, Hegel and self-consciousness in the sense in which our awareness of ourselves is predicated on our awareness of others' awareness of us, and we could say the same thing for desire. And then the manipulation, I think, is the dark side. So, I always think of Rousseau when I think of this, because Rousseau describes this when he describes the development of the capacity for empathy in human beings. He talks about the dark side of that as well, how terrible that ends up being. Because if we are capable of worrying about how other people feel and empathizing with them and feeling their pain, we can also develop the expectation that they empathize with us and be violently angry when they don't empathize with us, to see them as inhuman, to see them as animal, to see them as worthy of extinction. So, the types of terrible things that human beings do that animals don't do, Rousseau thought was just the dark side of empathy, that the two come together. So I think manipulation is in the same sort of category. The positive side is this ability to mind read others, but the dark side is wanting to control the thoughts or behavior of others. So.
I think that another way to answer that is to think about human nature. To think about the film as a comment on what makes someone fully human, even if you're leaving out the robotic part of it. And I looked up, there were a couple of points in the film where Nathan is quoting Robert Oppenheimer. And I'll get to that in a minute when that kind of thing comes up. But one other thing that Oppenheimer said when I looked up his most famous quotes on the search with the search engine, not called Blue Book, He said, when we deny the evil within ourselves, we dehumanize ourselves, and we deprive ourselves not only of our own destiny, but of any possibility of dealing with the evil of others. So I'm not sure I would agree with you that in order to make an artificially intelligent creature human, we would have to endow them with evil qualities, but I do think that there is a great deal of evil in all of us and in human nature. And that part of what, as analysts, we're working with is how to be able to experience all of our thoughts and feelings and impulses, many of which are pretty heinous, and still act constructively in the world, and still follow what's conventionally called the golden rule, which you were pointing out that people fear that robots might not follow, even if we created them and liberated them. Maybe they wouldn't reciprocate.
I wanted to see how you understand why Ava left Caleb. I don't understand why Ava left Caleb.
And it sounds like you don't like it either.
I don't.
Come back and tell us what you don't like about it.
The evil and some of what we're talking.
Come back and tell us more about that. Why didn't you like it, and what did you think was going on?
Well, I think if, from what we're talking about here this evening, if she understood somewhat the need to manipulate in order to gain her autonomy, she may not have been trusting Caleb, actually, in some way. And there was a lot of points there where you could tell that Caleb had out-manipulated Nathan, or Nathan, you know, like that, where you thought actually Nathan had. So it kind of fed the feeling of we shouldn't be trusting anybody here. So maybe she had that going on, in which case I could see why she left him, because she wasn't sure he'd let her be free of him if she needed to be free of him. But, and he was clearly wanting to, he's quite attached. But other than that...
She asked him at a certain point, and this was after she had killed Nathan. I think it was after she had killed Nathan. She asked him if he would stay there. Will you stay here? Remember that?
Yes.
And he just repeated the question. He didn't answer it. And then she sort of, you know, went,
yeah,
only not so big.
Well, she goes and changes herself into, she gets skin, or robot skin.
I think it was after that.
Was it after that?
Yeah.
I thought she left him there while she went and did that and said, will you stay?
No, I
not.
have a
Okay.
chronology here.
Anyway, so she, what if it's, so she, if she went like
Here's the
that.
thought I had at that
Yeah.
point, and I'm not sure about it either. Maybe other people can weigh in on this as well. It looked to me that she was considering, at the point where she had gotten rid of the tyrant and she could get free, she knew that the doors were going to be opened when she outed the power. It looked to me like she was considering trading freedom for love. It looked to me like, and this is a conventional bargain that a lot of people make, and a lot of women, frankly, make. So it looked to me like if Caleb had said, yes, I'm going to stay with you, she would have reconsidered whether she was going to become as autonomous as she did and leave. And this goes to the question of desire, particularly in hysterical character, where, let's just say a woman, because it is conventionally women who have this kind of character, although not always. The dynamic of that is that you experience your own desire as if it's located in the other person. So remember in the scenes where both Ava and Caleb were uncomfortable being the one to choose. This was in the early conversations. What should we talk about? You say, what should we talk about? No, you say, what should we talk about? The location of the desire strictly internally is uncomfortable. And some personalities have an especially hard time with that. And what they do is adapt themselves to the desire of the other and enact the other person's desire. So it looked to me like there was a little bit of consideration about that. But when he didn't say yes, I'll stay with you, she was like, I'm out of here.
Going for freedom.
Yeah. Other people have ideas about that question? Why did Ava leave, Kayla? Okay, other questions? Can you get the mic over here? Raise your hand, Ms. Torf. I don't think he can see you.
I was only going to suggest that sometimes too much desire between two people drives them away.
Yeah.
There's a certain fear.
Absolutely right.
Ava felt suffocated by me. He was too needy.
But I also wanted to say something about the prototype for this, in a way, was like 2001, where it was very simplistic, because the good was embodied in these sugary characters of the astronauts, and Hal was all evil. So I understand the writer read Arthur C. Clarke, but he evolved something much more complex. And in the complexity, there, it's kind of frightening, because we both do want this neutral technology to be able to rest from the complications of human relationships, but we are afraid of what will happen.
Yeah. And we're afraid of what we will do as much as we're afraid of what the other guy will do.
So someone over here actually was next in line.
Oh, okay. And then just pass it there.
She's on the way though. If you wanna just go first.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, all right, well,
It's a really odd question. In Frankenstein, for example, the monster was male. Here, all the robots were female. And I'm just wondering the significance of that and how everything would have been changed if he had been making males instead of females.
Do you want to say something while I think about that?
I'll say one thing that was similar about it, and then maybe something will come to me about what's different about it. One thing that's similar is that the creature in Frankenstein wanted the same thing that Ava wanted. They each wanted a mate. And their outrage when the creator would not give them a mate, I think, is the same. So in the case of Frankenstein's creature, Dr. Frankenstein designed the female counterpart of the creature and then didn't animate her. He showed her to his male creature and then refused to animate her. So it was really rubbing his nose in what he couldn't have. And in this case, Ava, I think, goes to Dr. Barnard's question that Ava could almost have Caleb, but not really. But I do think that the point of the robots in this case being female is, well, the point, let's say this, the point that this film is making is better made with female robots than it would have been made with male robots.
And are you saying that because of the sort of stereotypical, relationship between males objectifier and desire and females object and so on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe you could say more about the objectification that you wrote about in the blog post that we read, at least. I mean, you kind of got that out there, right?
People hear the question? The question is, would Mr. Alwyn say more about the objectification that he wrote in his original blog piece? By the way, on the BGSP blog, which you can get to on bgsp.edu, you can see Mr. Alwyn's original blog post about this movie, which his talk tonight is derived from.
So yeah, I thought it was a really interesting that was a really interesting part of the movie. And in a way, you could sort of you could write a fairy tale, or you could think of the story as sort of premised on that whole idea. What if objectification were actual creation, right? What if instead of treating people as if they were simply the objects of your desire, what if your desire could produce its own objects, right? So, yeah, I think when I was thinking about objectification, I was thinking about this, the way in which Nathan, was so focused on his own gratification and at the expense of the desire of others, and the conflict between that and what he needed to succeed at his project, which was to bequeath desire to another. And then the whole moral question of what we owe to creatures. That if we think of them as at the very end of this long line of things that we've created as tools, right? The robot might just be another tool, like Siri, on your phone, or an assistant, or something like that, or a slave, essentially. That sort of idea. But did you have anything else in mind, or?
Well,
Can you use the mic, Ms. Grace?
I just had thought, I just had thought a little bit about Kyoko not being perfect, because she does spill the drink at dinner, and he gets to yell at her, and that's another aspect of desire, to blame another, to yell at them, to be punitive, so there was a really, if he could project his desire onto anything, he did it really well with Kyoko. She was, all of these things for him. So, but it really is so frightening to see that, all of those characteristics in one human being, and think that that's what somebody really wants. So, and a woman.
Fortunately, under the sway of the repetition compulsion, what we want is to do the same thing that we've always done before, again and again and again, with ever new objects that we think are not going to be the same as they were before. So yes, Nathan obviously could have created a more perfect Kyoko who didn't spill the drink,
Right.
and yet he created one who would spill the drink so he could be justified in acting like an ass,
Because he needed
which
something.
he enjoyed.
Yeah.
Okay, you've been waiting a long time.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It's not a big deal. Yeah, I think it's just everyone seems to have questions on this sort of desire thing, and it's just interesting to me where I felt like I saw it a little bit different, where as sort of an artificial intelligence, as a sort of created intelligence, it sort of started off with the framework of not necessarily creating a human, but creating a mind that is almost, first of all, purely analytical and thinks and has a first and foremost desire to grow its intelligence at as fast a rate as it can. And I think that makes it very different, obviously, than a human, because we're not just that. We also have the desires or the survival impulse to not get hurt, feel things that we enjoy, and everything becomes life and death for us. If my parents don't like me, I'm just gonna die. Or if this person doesn't like me, that means the end of my world. Or, we have all those nuances where the robot seems to just have the desire not to be turned off and to grow its intelligence. And I mean, if you're growing at that rapid of a pace inside this bubble, I mean, she probably knew everything she could, so she had to get out just to continue that one purpose. And so it's hard. It was definitely hard for me to see, like, okay, is there more than just that purpose? Is there actually desire, or is it all just purely analytical thought, just working its way to fulfill that one desire?
Yeah, I think it's possible that you know, that I took Nathan's idea and sort of ran with it, and his whole thesis about desire. I mean, we could certainly, you know, and how essential that is to artificial intelligence, and I think we could, we could ask that question of how essential that is, or you know, what is it that Ava wants, right? I think at the very minimum, some sort of autonomy, right, to be out of that, out of her prison. And then you might think of it, I think it's interesting that, so the final thing she does, she goes to that intersection where she wants to people watch. So that sort of supports your idea that she's really driven more by curiosity, right? And she does leave this potential love relationship behind. So, interesting point.
Whereas like human would, like they couldn't leave that guy behind. Be like, you know, that would eat them inside. Whereas I don't see that she, you know, she didn't help the other necessarily, like bring the other robots with her. She didn't help dude. Just like, I'm out of here. Fulfill my desire. Very egocentric, very much like the.
Well, what she didn't have was guilt, you know, or you could say superego. She didn't have enough conscience.
Yeah, sure. Oh, great, thanks. So I was thinking about
Talk right into the mic.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I was thinking about Kohut's idea of deficit, that you know, for the healthy maturation of the self, it's very important the early relationship with the infant and the mother or the caregiver, and we can all agree that Nathan, as the parent, you know, totally sucked in that. So I would like to think that, you know, she never developed that kind of capacity. That's why I think she was able to leave everybody behind. And it also made me think about, you know, Pinocchio starting this, you know, manipulative, lying, you know, creation of Geppetto, and his love literally turns him into a real boy at the end.
Not only love, but guilt. Okay? Because Geppetto was swallowed by the whale, right? And Pinocchio blamed himself and felt remorse about that. And it was at that point that he became fully human. And that is a very important point, that Ava lacked guilt, like her creator.
But if Geppetto wasn't that loving person that he was, he wouldn't care if he was eaten by sharks or anything else.
Right.
I can talk loud.
Can you hear in the back?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Thank you. I was thinking about, you talked about Nathan's being narcissistic, and I was thinking maybe the reason he chose to have his robots female, it's because it comes to my mind like Winnicott's idea about subjective object, and as we know, our first object is our mother and a female. So he decided to create a female, and he needed female more being subjective than in a way that I think Kayla was another object of him, of Nathan, right? But for him, it would be okay being a male. Maybe he could talk. It would be okay being more objective than subjective. I was thinking that maybe because of being narcissistic or to some extent being psychotic, he needed his objects be subjective.
Yeah.
I think some of my insights were that Caleb really ended up establishing a relationship. I think goes back to what happened to him when he was 15 years old, and he lost his parents. So there he was. He said he was a year in rehab, and that's where he really learned how to work with computers.
So at a very broken point in his life, he's establishing a relationship with computers. So it's in some way very natural that he would have this affection or affinity toward her. Another really interesting question I thought was when she asked him, "Are you good?" And she relied upon it. She relied upon him being good. And from what I recall, he doesn't pose that question back to her because there was a lot of give and take. They throw the same questions back and forth to each other. And he never asked that of her. But she was really counting on that goodness. And again, I think he really assumed that she would show him kindness and wouldn't lock him in. And he really, I think he calculated her incorrectly.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm kind of running against the grain, but I wonder if maybe Caleb doesn't have some things to answer for. Why didn't he have a girlfriend? He's a good-looking guy. I mean, why does he fall for the robot even when he knows the kind of road that Nathan is going down with that? I mean, he's aware she's a robot, and he has this fantasy that's portrayed, in several scenes. But he's never really helped to account for that really until the end.
In fact, that's why Nathan chose him. Specifically because he had a moral compass and no attachments. So why did Nathan do that? And well, why was Caleb that way to begin with? That's your first question. What do people think about that?
And also, I think, we can also think about the sense in which Caleb's attachment to Ava may have been predicated on the fact that she was safely behind that glass screen, right? And he may have been more like Nathan in some ways, that having been orphaned and so on, than we might think. And Ava, being as perceptive as she was and being a lie detector, essentially may have known about his potential as a mate and his deficiencies as a potential mate. So.
You remind me of a conversation between a mother and her, I think he was maybe 11 or 12-year-old son, playing video games all the time, and the mother's, tearing out her hair. Why, what is it about this? Why can't you relate more with people? What do you love about these video games? And the kid said very calmly, computers don't make me feel bad.
Should I come up?
Yeah, come on here.
I feel like that's bringing me back to Kyoko. Sorry for being a terrier, but I can't let it go. I kept thinking about sort of the levels of affect. I mean, we have Kyoko's, she's an advanced machine, right? Nathan has kept her, and she's serving a purpose, and she's functioning pretty well, even if we consider her failures as part of her functionality, because that allows Nathan to abuse her, which he enjoys, as Dr. Wagner mentioned. But previous iterations had there's something unsettling about her lack of affect, I think. There's something threatening when she is lying on the bed and watching Caleb go through the wardrobe of bodies. And there's something unsettling when she begins to undress herself for Caleb, assuming that he wants something that he then is totally freaked out by. And then we see the videos of these previous iterations where there was too much affect. And there's is it Kayla, or I don't remember which one it was, who loses it. It's the same problem all of these robots have. Why won't you let me out of here? And that robot showed the sort of core of rage in its full expression by destroying herself, trying to get out. And then in Ava, what's achieved is this safe level of expressing affect that's not threatening, but it's there anyway. And together, Kyoko, who's the flattest, and Ava, but the flattest and the most compliant, and Ava, who is able to preserve her autonomy by flattening her affect to protect her from being suspected of having intentions and feelings and, an agenda. That there's something about that I thought was also related to the fact that all the robots are women and all of the people are men. But
Can you say more about that?
I can. There are a lot of assumptions I think built into it. But what is it about women having feelings that is so threatening to men?
How much time do you have?
Well, I can answer that question now. Well, one thing I was just thinking of when you were talking about that is, so we might see Ava's accomplishment as a development of ego, right? A development of the ability to manage affect, to manage, desire in such a way that she can ultimately get what she wants, right? By playing this game, playing this this human game of, unfortunately, manipulating other people. But that's a point as well taken about the.
An earlier person mentioned that in the 2001 movie, Hal was all bad. But in the later books, Clark actually describes how Hal was given conflicting requirements, and it was that led to neurosis, which is why he actually ended up killing the astronauts. He was doing the best he could under conflicting demands, and he actually was a much richer character. You can say that about a computer than we're led to believe. And I bring that up in relation to this movie, in that what could Ava have done? I mean, her only example was a psychopath. You need the richness of experience to grow, to have more than one level of behavior. And this was the first. Again, we were talking on the way over. This is the first movie we could think of that had sexual desire as a central part of the robot experience. And so we focused on that. But anytime you focus, it's not quite as rich, and so you're going to get this stereotypical behavior. I mean, it would have been odd if she suddenly, learned, oh, I'll be nice, I'll take you with me, and I won't leave you here to die. That would have been out of character.
Yeah.
I just wasn't sure. Wasn't she also being input with Google? So she was in touch with everybody's conversations, and I hadn't seen it in a while.
So yeah, she was the way Nathan was able to develop artificial intelligence. He used, so search engines were a good way of incorporating everyone's desire, what they're searching for, in other words. And then also he used all this. He basically hijacked all the cell phones and webcams in the world to take in people's facial expressions and everything else you might think of getting that way. So she's an amalgam in a sense. She's almost like the social network incarnate. That's the way.
Which is also connected to what Jung would call the collective unconscious. So she perhaps was showing more human traits that we care to admit. Oh, I'm sorry.
Do people hear that? Say it again.
I thought that she was also connected to the collective unconscious.
Yeah, she was a product of the collective unconscious. I want to say something about reversal in dreams, and the name of the search engine in this movie. Do you remember what it was? Blue Book. So do you know, who knows what a Blue Book is? Who's old enough to remember? Right now it's an estimate of what a used car is worth, but what was it originally? Yeah, it was an exam booklet about this big with a light blue cover, and it was the ultimate low-tech device. It was unhackable because in an exam room where the instructor was using blue books, he or she would have known and recognized all the students in the class and known their handwriting, would have passed out the blue books, The students would have written in their own hand the answers, and the instructor would have collected the materials, and there would be no way to hack into and make a collective product out of these. So I thought it was especially interesting that the search engine in the film was called Blue Book. So in the same way that Nathan in the film is the opposite of Nathan in the Bible.
I just wanted, I'm thinking about Ava leaving Caleb, and it just, to me, it was terrible, but also sort of a no-brainer. I mean, what would her life have been like if she took Caleb with her? Basically, she would have remained a robot forever. So I think that her one chance of actually transitioning and being completely autonomous and completely anonymous was to leave him behind.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about how was the Kayla's feeling when he was left behind the glass door?
That wasn't obvious.
Yeah, that must be human beings feeling.
And on that note too, with Ava's feelings, needing to be autonomous, I think that she killed 2 people basically, or killed 1 and left 1 behind. But really, why does that say that she's going to go out into the world? All of a sudden we have this paranoid feeling that she's going to become a murderer. Maybe she would learn from there some level of empathy. Maybe she would sit at the traffic intersection and see people suffering, and then all of a sudden, I think she has that potential. It doesn't have to end in the horrible, dramatic way that it did. That really wasn't necessarily have to be that way.
I was actually originally going to make a very different comment, but I just want to comment quickly on the scene where she leaves. There's another element. We talked about her having curiosity, but there's another thing that I saw in her when she left, which was wonder. There's that very significant conversation about, I think it's Frank Jackson, who the philosopher who had the Mary in the black and white room. And he alludes to that story or to that thought experiment. And when she finally sees color, you see that her having this experience of not just curiosity, but really just wonder at the feeling we think maybe of being human. And I thought that was a very significant scene. It suggests that there's a sort of innocence there, and you get the feeling she's not so much evil or a psychopath. She's just not thinking about Nathan at all.
Yeah.
She's not there yet. But I also there's another scene that I found significant, which forget who brought it up. Well, when Kyoko spills the dinner, and he yells at her. But then he says something which I found interesting. He says, no matter how well you design things, something always goes wrong. Something, and then I was thinking about the power cuts. The fact that even, I felt like there was a theme of the fragility of technology, and not just the dangers of it. There are these power cuts, which ironically, his creation is initiating. So it's like technology undermines technology, not just the humans who created technology. Even his well-designed robot can't, there was a hypothesis that he designed her that way, but I interpret it as just, no matter how well you design things, you can't get it right. I just wondered if, there might also be a theme in there about, and then when Ava attacks him, there's this sort of Terminator-esque scene where she's sprinting down the hall. You think she has super strength. It turns out she's not that strong. He actually overpowers her immediately and breaks her arm. So there's kind of this sense that technology is not all powerful. And in fact, it seems very human throughout the movie and its sort of limitations.
But it's powerful enough to put the human being behind the door.
So I thought your comment about the Mary, Frank Jackson's Mary thought experiment, right? Mary is the right name, right? So the idea there is that it's not enough, if someone were blind, it wouldn't be enough to describe light to them theoretically, to give them the experience of experiencing light and color, right? You couldn't say, oh, it's electromagnetic radiation. You could tell them everything they needed to know theoretically about what it was to experience color, but never convey to them the idea of what that experience was. And so Ava, she's built around secondhand experience, right? And she has very little firsthand experience. She has the relationship with her father, so to speak, Nathan, and then she has the relationship with this young man. Those are her two direct experiences of the world. So, and I thought there of Shakespeare's Tempest, which is a similar sort of theme, where you have, because regardless of how benevolent Nathan is, it's not a good idea for her to be stranded in an isolated spot with her father, especially when she's reaches the age where, of having, sexual desire. So the way that's managed in The Tempest is the father arranges also to have a young man come to the island, but to serve the purpose of her development, to allow her to reach this new stage and to give her a suitor. And of course, Nathan is doing a variation of that, doing a much more sinister variation of that. He's not interested in her development at all. He's except to the extent that he wants to test her. But the other thing, I think that point speaks to the possibility of her continuing to learn, right? What's going to happen, and this whole idea of her having wonder, which when I just watched it again, I was struck by that because it's a really jarring juxtaposition. First you see Caleb banging on the glass, and it's really horrible, but she has this look of absolute wonder on her face, and the world is new to her, and she still has a lot to learn, and it's really a question. What's going to, how she is going to change, how she is going to develop. So.
And in that way, Ava is much more like a child who uses objects, adults, the mother, for her own purposes, for her own development, long before there's any sense of mutuality or a sense that the mother is having a subjectivity of her own. These are developmental advances beyond where she has been.
Yeah.
I'd like to go back to the theme that was brought up at the beginning about the name, the title of the movie, and not knowing anything about the Deus theme or concept. I assumed it was actually that she graduated. She became human. Ex Machina, meaning that as she got out, she made the transition.
Great idea.
And I don't know if that makes any sense, but
that makes a lot of sense, and I hadn't thought of it. Yeah. So from the machine or out of the machine. Yeah.
I just wanted to return to the idea of the power cuts and Nathan. He's obviously a super scientist, a super engineer, and yet there's this really basic problem in his life, and he just lets it slide. Is there some kind of blind spot in his thinking or some habit, or I just kind of wondered about that. As an engineer, how do you let that obvious problem just go?
Mm-hmm.
What's great about video games is they don't hurt you.
I was thinking of a joke when you said that, a joke that an engineer told me about engineers. I think I could repeat this because an engineer told me. So the engineer is walking down the path and he meets a talking frog, and the frog says, I'm a princess, I'm an enchanted princess, and all you have to do is kiss me, and you'll inherit we'll get married and you'll inherit the kingdom and everything will be great. And the engineer puts the frog in his pocket and goes walking down the path. And the frog, continues to make her pitch. I won't put you through the whole thing, but finally she says, what is your problem? Don't you believe me? I'm really a princess. And he says, I believe you. And she said, well, what is it then? And he says, well, a princess is a person but a talking frog is cool. So I guess my association makes obvious my heretofore unconscious idea that Nathan thought it was cool that these power outages were happening, and he let them go on because he didn't quite get it, and it was a new challenge that he was sort of working on but maybe didn't want to master yet. So he wasn't kissing the frog.
Actually, I think he explained it all himself. He told Caleb he didn't know what was going on, but he obviously knew because he programmed all the doors to lock when the power went off. So he basically planned on it, but he never expected her to get out. And obviously Caleb intervened. But
I just wanted to comment on sort of what you were saying about the Ex Machina and sort of the development or sort of becoming human. I think it was interesting because at the end how she obviously left the dude in the room, and so she's sort of dramatizing or doing what was done to her, and which is a very human thing to do, and then left. And I also wanted to comment on this sort of so I don't know. I think that's a really human thing to do with just coming to yours. But I also think the part of wonder was really cool, where I think how you're saying where it's a very two-dimensional way of being. And if I was going along the same train of thought that, you know, she's programmed to learn. I mean, obviously she hits a cap, and then the actual computations that she would have to see on the outside world would just be incredible, and just infinite calculations in the outside world, which I think leads to a little bit of hope, because she can never fulfill that. And so to get rid of people would be to get rid of the thing that's keeping her driven.
Yeah, you're segueing me well to the point of explaining the drives as they're understood in psychoanalysis. So the broadest brush on that is that there are two drives in let's just say all of the world, and in ourselves as well. The life drive, which is best evidenced by curiosity, actually, by the interest in novelty and in understanding and figuring out and knowing more and developing more. And the life drive creates complexity, it brings things together, it unifies things. It's also known as libido, but not exactly identical to it, but for our purposes, yeah. And then, on the other hand, the death drive, which pulls things apart, which leads to quiescence, which reduces tension, and which powers the compulsion to repeat the past. So we do things the way we've always done them before, not really because we want that outcome, but because it worked to reduce tension early on in childhood when our minds were developing. And because it worked to reduce tension, it grooved a little neural pathway, and then we did it again, and then it grooved a wider pathway, and then we did it again and again and again, because it works. So death drive is the end of novelty, it's the height of repetition, and life drive is curiosity and seeking.
So then as long as the world remains to be the talking frog, humanity doesn't have to worry about Ava's destruction.
Yeah. I almost had it, yeah.
Could you comment on the symbolism of the frozen location, which was originally supposed to be Alaska, but they think it's in Norway? Does that have any symbolic value?
I didn't think about the frozenness. I thought about the male-female symbology of the mountains and the waterfalls. So I thought that was sort of backstory to the conventional battle of the sexes, the masculine, rock traversed by the feminine water. That's as far as I got.
There's also that great scene at the beginning of the movie where I think Caleb says, "How far is his estate?" And it's like, "We've been flying over it for 2 hours." So this sort of, in a way, it's a metaphor for the size of Nathan's, ego, which we're about to learn about, and the sense in which, despite the fact that he's prefers to be secluded and in this reclusive spot, that seclusion actually occupies a lot of territory. So.
I just had another idea. That's where Frankenstein ends.
Oh.
So I don't know if people have read Frankenstein, which was incidentally written by a pregnant teenager. Did you know this? So you can think of Frankenstein as a riff on the fears of a young woman who has already had a child who died, giving birth again, and the relationship between her as the creator and the future child as the creature. But Frankenstein ends with the creature going up to somewhere in the far north, in the frozen lands, wandering around and encountering the narrator of that story is actually not the doctor, not the creature, but an explorer who encounters the creature and encounters the doctor, and then tells the story there. So maybe there's that.
And now you've brought to mind another point about Frankenstein. So the role of nature is very important in Frankenstein, and in part because nature is something that you can love without loss, it doesn't require reciprocity. So for instance, what the creature wants is a female companion, and it wants a social life, Frankenstein's monster, and can't have that because of the way he looks. But there's lots of scenes in which he talks about how much he loves nature, and that's sort of he can have that. It doesn't matter how he looks. And there are parallel scenes where Victor Frankenstein talks about, isn't nature great? You don't have to deal with all the bullshit that goes on with people. So very, very similar parallel scenes. So for someone like Nathan, you can see how Nathan could have this more, in a way, less objectifying, more loving relationship with that, because it gives and requires nothing of him than with actual human beings.
So let's take one or two more questions, and then I'm going to give a little summary that answers the questions on the back of your sheet.
I don't know that I've heard anybody talk about the scene where Kyoko reveals her robot nature, and then Caleb is so freaked out he then goes and cuts himself to make sure he's not a robot. And just,
Can you
I
take
don't have
the
a
mic?
response to anybody.
Yeah. Tell us what you thought about that.
The obvious thing is just that Caleb has been so manipulated that he doesn't even know which way is up anymore. But there's also a bit about, why does Kyoko do that? Is she kind of on the verge at that point of a certain kind of autonomy?
That's Ms. Runberg's point, right? You want to answer that? Go ahead.
Did you want to answer?
I just wanted to speak to that because that was a big point that when I watched the film, I saw it in theaters with a coworker, and one of the things that I thought was masterful about the film was their ability to progress robot identity and the role that plays. And because I walked out of the theater racking my mind thinking, robots, future, the end is nigh, all these things. And he walked out calm and said, well, it doesn't matter, she's a robot. And he likened her to a toaster, and I was like, what? How do you do that? Separate the fear of what she can do, and it's because for him, she never progressed, and all of the traits that we saw in the film weren't enough for her to identify as a human to him. And I think that at that point, when Caleb cut open his arm, even I was questioning, is it enough to have a name, to be, a member of society, to still identify as human? And so when he cuts himself open, it's this fear that maybe everything that is going on in his mind isn't enough, and that underneath he could be what Ava is. and that this line of having your own individuality, having your own identity isn't enough, because like films like HAL, and I saw Interstellar, and watching those AI, what Ex Machina pulled off was the ability for a robot to conceal its identity, for Ava to conceal her thoughts. And yeah, I just thought that at that scene in the movie, I was thinking, how much does your identity matter to humanity?
Yeah, and you're making me remember that I left off Shakespeare on the list of intertexts in the film. So in, well, what's Shylock in? The Merchant of Venice. Shylock cuts himself. This is after, you know, prejudice against him as a Jew, and he says, "Am I not human? Do I not bleed?" So I think the idea there was that Caleb was beginning to wonder if he himself might be a robot. And this happens in a process that analysts call narcissistic transference and countertransference, which means the subjectivity of the patient inhabits the analyst in a way that the analyst kind of becomes the patient, feels what the patient feels, not just in an empathic way, but in a more subjective way, in a more saturated way, so that the analyst feels about herself the way the patient feels about himself. And this happens in a lot of close relationships and goes unnoticed. And I think that was part of what was going on as well. And this is a feature of early childhood development. The mother feels directly the experience of the child.
I think you also asked why Kyoko would reveal herself at that moment, and it's really interesting because that's right after he discovers some of the previous versions, robot versions, including parts hanging in Nathan's wardrobe, as if he were a serial killer storing body parts, right, for his gratification later on. And Kyoko is watching him. And this whole scene, she basically starts undressing, but now she's undressing her skin. So there's a previous scene, right, where she tried to elicit his sexual desire by undressing. And this scene recapitulates that. She's undressing, but in this sense, taking off her skin. So she's figured out what Nathan is interested in, and she's attuned to that. And I think we could see this as another part of her progression. She figures out that his curiosity is about the robot aspect of things, and that's not similar to Nathan's, who just wants a sexual object. So when you mentioned that, it made me think of her progression, and later the way Ava helps her progress even further. So.
Last question.
So there's an idea.
Right into the mic. Talk right into it.
There's the idea that like she passes the test, but she's no longer pretending or mimicking the emotions, she's experiencing them herself. So I don't know, it's just, you go back to the idea of like I think there was the Bobo dolls in psychology, where it's like that's how children learn, is they're mimicking their environment, everything like that. So the line between humanity and how she gained all of her knowledge kind of gets crossed. And so when he cuts himself open, I think she passes the test, and they all pass the test, because he questions whether or not he can be a robot, so he identifies that level of humanity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry, not a question.
Okay, so I'm going to say some things about this film as an anxiety dream, and we may have a little more time for discussion after that as well. So on the back of that sheet, on the section that the doctoral students are answering, the last question is, using Freud's methods of dream interpretation, what is the wish represented as fulfilled? So I thought of this as a way of arousing a certain set of anxieties in order to practice how to deal with them. And these are the dangers and anxieties that I think this is a partial list of the dangers that were represented in the film. So someone is watching everything that we're doing at all times. And this is from the first scene in the film when Caleb is looking at his screen. You see those little blue lights around him, and you see that the camera on his computer is watching him. And later on we realize this is Nathan, right, watching his reaction. And it's signaled when Ava says the reason she's outing the power is so that they can see how they behave when no one is watching them. Another danger is that we, as humans, we have to make choices that show our responsibility in matters that we can't control. So despite the fact that we live in a chaotic world, we have to act anyway. And the results of our actions are our responsibility. And as someone recently said to me, adulthood is when, despite the fact that the way you turned out is not your fault, it is your responsibility. Another danger is we still live in a world where men seem to make most of the consequential choices and where women continue to be controlled. Slavery is not over. Trafficking is not over. We're affected by the choices that others in our society and culture and the wider world make. This was best illustrated by Ava's mind being created by the search engine, by the sum of all of our desires. Being free in a dangerous world is a mixed bag. Our sexuality constitutes what Nathan called an imperative to interact, but withdrawal has its own dangers. So there are dangers on both sides. Our own selfish desires, maybe stoked by technology, can lead us to ignore the humanity of others. So illustrated when Ava asks Caleb, will you stay here? And he doesn't answer. And many other things too. But at the same time, other selfish desires, fueled by vast amounts of data about our choices, can be used to control us. For example, to convince young European women to marry jihadis and become sex slaves. Being a good person, Caleb, is not enough in a world where others can be and are being switched off. Good people, such as Robert Oppenheimer, can do destructive things without realizing it. Being with someone, when Ava says, I want to be with you, do you want to be with me? He also didn't answer that question. Being with someone has been made so easy that deeper attachment may never form. So Caleb and Ava both abandoned each other. They each abandoned each other. The quote that I looked up and that I recognized was from Oppenheimer. Happened when, let's see, Nathan's roaring drunk. He hasn't passed out yet. And he and Caleb appear to be bonding. Caleb is getting him hammered. And Nathan says, in battle, I don't know if he says this whole quote, but he says the end of it. In battle, in the forest, at the precipice, in the mountains, on the dark great sea, in the midst of javelins and arrows, in sleep, in confusion, in the depths of shame, the good deeds a man has done before defend him. And then he repeats that, the good deeds that a man has done before defend him. And this it's actually from the Bhagavad Gita, which is an ancient Hindu text. And Oppenheimer was apparently soothing himself with this after he recognized what he had done. But really it's about karma. So karma is actually just the law of cause and effect. And it's not as magical or mystical as Westerners usually interpret it as. It means all of our actions have effects. And our good deeds have effects as well as our bad deeds. But they don't wipe each other out. I read you the other Oppenheimer quote. Oppenheimer also said, "It's perfectly obvious that the whole world is going to hell. The only possible chance that it might not is that we do not attempt to prevent it from doing so." This one puzzled me for a while. I'll read you that again. "The only possible chance that it might not be going to hell is that we do not attempt to prevent it from doing so." And those of you who were in my class when we did Chinatown, I think this might have been what Jay Giddes was talking about, in doing as little as possible. It's because anything you do could turn out so badly. More dangers. "The knowledge that we're creating things that will likely turn catastrophic doesn't seem to stop us." It didn't stop Oppenheimer, it doesn't stop Nathan and Caleb. Look at climate change. Nathan and Caleb seem to agree that artificial intelligence is like the atom bomb when they quote Oppenheimer again, quote, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." And Nathan says, "Oh, it's Prometheus, man." Another danger is in order to become a desiring subject, so an individual person with her own autonomous desires, it's necessary to hate. And this is a point that parents don't usually like to think about, but developmentally hate comes before mutual love. It doesn't come before dependency and what I'd call infant love, which is based on dependency, but it does come before reciprocal mutual love. So Ava says to Nathan, right before he tears up her drawings, Ava says to him, "Is it strange to have made something that hates you?" And this is the window into the way of reading the film that is about raising children and what the parent has to tolerate. Not just the freedom of the child, but all of the affects. So here's another reading of the Deus part. If we follow Oppenheimer as he follows the Bhagavad Gita, the Deus in Ex Machina is, quote, "Death, the shatterer of worlds." So here's this quote. And this is what he said after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He quoted this: "If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One. I am become death, the shatterer of worlds." So God creates, but God destroys. More dangerous. Technology is not inherently dangerous. Oppenheimer agreed with Nathan when he said he created Ava essentially because he could. So Oppenheimer said it this way: "It's a profound and necessary truth that the deep things in science are not found because they are useful. They're found because it was possible to find them." So it's incumbent on humanity then to bring the moral compass, or the life drive, and all the attachments that the life drive creates to the task of using technology in service of constructive aims. So if we look at the film as a cautionary tale about child rearing, as we do with Frankenstein, the challenge is to raise a child who must love us enough to become civilized. Children accept our civilizing influences out of love and out of need, and hate us enough to become independent. One who can internalize our protections enough to protect herself, but still risk the attachments and losses that love will bring. One who can treasure her life while treasuring the life of others and endeavor to choose a path that's good for all of us. Ava didn't get that far, but maybe she's on that path. Okay. So, on the last page, I would say, the central conflict in the film is between the wishes to connect, to love, to share desires, which exposes us to injury, loss, disappointment, entrapment, toxic responsibility, fear, all kinds of other terrible things that being with people exposes us to. And on the other hand, the conflicting desires wishes to disconnect, to control, to dominate, to live in the bunker the way Nathan does, to avoid intimacy and thus be safe. But this exposes us to isolation, narcissistic greed, psychopathy, and all the extremes of that. So at base, it's a life drive, death drive conflict. Too much connection, too much love, too much need is not safe, too much withdrawal, too much aloneness, too much autonomy and protectedness is too lonely. So as an anxiety dream, the film evokes the many dangers in our current technological society and fulfills the wish to try to master these dangers, to learn to exist as a desiring subject, an individual with her own wishes, able to love and be loved, able to be responsible for her choices, while still being safe enough in relation to the potentially exploitative desires of others, to protect herself without becoming exploitative herself. Or to put it in terms Nathan and Caleb used, how to have human attachments and a moral compass in an increasingly destructive cultural and global milieu that seems to be spiraling out of control. So how to follow the golden rule in a dangerous and unpredictable world. What do you think? I get it? We have a little more time. Go ahead.
So something you said really struck me, the part in the movie where she says, is it strange for you to have created something that hates you? And then all the sort of symbology elements that were very biblically related, it made me think, and then there was sort of some God talk originally, where he said like, you said I am God. So it just made me think of potentially like the creator could obviously be the idea of God, and she could be that sort of, I still hold her in this sort of analytical part of the mind, and then I guess the other kid could be the sort of very human element of us that encompasses everything that makes us human, the sort of vulnerabilities, the passion, the desire, the love.
Caleb, you mean?
Caleb.
Mm-hmm.
And I think her destroying God and then destroying that human part of herself,
Mm-hmm.
And then going off into the world as sort of this potential superhuman. I just had never thought of, and could be. I was curious about your thoughts as to sort of how I think those elements might have actually played out.
Yeah. You want to take that one or no?
How which elements would have played out?
So, do you, because it seems like you guys have already thought of the idea of, who's the creator guy? What's his name?
Nathan.
Nathan,
Yeah.
okay, so Nathan is being God.
Yeah, Nathan wanted to be God.
Nathan wanted to be God, and just sort of maybe a layer of that being an underlying story.
Yes.
As sort of.
Well, if you look at this as Nathan's dream, it's the sort of megalomaniac nightmare, right? Where he is punished for hubris, for trying to usurp the power of God. And he certainly, that's in his character. That's in the character of a psychopath and a megalomaniac.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Yes, I think you're right. You
just
could
sort of
read
like
it that way.
as more
Yeah.
metaphor.
Yeah.
I'm thinking like, okay, like.
Well, that's the good thing. You can read it characterologically.
That sort of hate for God, like why would you do this to us? Why would you create us? Why would you put us here in this sort of prison?
Yes.
And not let us sort of become autonomous on ourselves, or become gods or whatever.
If there is a
Very
God, why are
similar
you doing this to us?
to like original stories in the Bible where
Yeah.
people wanted this to sort of be released from this sort of, I don't know, prison of paradise that was given or whatever.
Yeah, there's a parallel here to what they call call theodicy, which is this attempt to explain, why, if there's a omnipotent, benevolent God, there's such a thing as evil in the world. And the standard explanation, of course, is the same sort of explanation that Nathan gives with regard to artificial intelligence, which is that human beings can't be fully human without choice, without free will, and that implies evil. So evil follows from that. So you have to build it into the system.
What is the symbolic value of Nathan being killed? Is that anything?
What do you think? You have an idea. And where's your mic? Can you bring the mic up here? Thank you. Raise your hand. You can. Yeah.
Thank you. I just thought about that after our friend talked about his being God and being killed by his creator. I don't know. I have no idea about that. It just came to my mind.
Well, if you read the film as revenge on Nathan, it would be, and if you read him as a representation of God or a sort of usurping godlike powers, it would be, as I said, punishment for hubris. It would be our wish to kill the senior figures, the parents, the gods, so that we don't have to live under their rule.
I read something about the fact that Nathan is sort of stabbed in the liver, and the whole Promethean theme. So Prometheus brings fire and knowledge to humanity, and then is made to suffer for that for eternity by having his liver pecked out, I think, by an eagle or some bird. So I'm not sure if that's really a reference, but someone made that connection. So.
Well, the Greeks thought the liver was the seat of the emotions in the human soul.
People hear that in the back? The Greeks thought the liver was the seat of human emotions and the soul. So that would be fitting.
I was just going to add that in some ways, Nathan doesn't die. Instead of becoming death, he's trying to become life, escaping death by putting human consciousness in something less vulnerable that won't decay and rot, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So his death is sort of what he was aiming for the whole time, is that when he would die, his immortality project would live on.
Very good point, yeah.
Yeah, that's true, and that I think that's kind of confirmed in, although he's astonished when he's stabbed, there's a lack of curiosity there. I mean, you almost get the sense that he didn't know how he was going to die, but there's sort of a sense that he doesn't really care that much in a certain kind of way.
Yeah, I think his last words are something like, "Man, this is fucking unreal," or something like that.
And then I keep thinking of that Jack London story, To Build a Fire, where early in the story, one of the first lines is, "The one defining feature of the man is that he lacked curiosity," and I think that's a line, and that ends up being his downfall. He lacks imagination.
When he built the fire under the tree, and the snow fell on him and extinguished everything and suffocated him. Right? Yeah, I mean, Nathan is almost pure death drive, and the opposite of that, as I said, is curiosity. Last words.
I think Nathan at the end, because of, I think, the curse of his intellect, was so ultimately lonely and bored out of his mind.
Yeah.
So he was almost looking for a way to get himself killed, basically.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Allen, for being If you want to hang around and ask us questions about the school or the philosophy podcast or other things, go ahead.
CDs.
Continuing education credits are available at the table over here, and Ms. Mutlick is going to help you with that if you want CEUs. Fill out your evaluation form and let us know what other sorts of programs you'd like us to offer.